Is there anything you would have done differently?
We reported a true story.
Our colleague Brian Williams is back in Kuwait City tonight after a close call in the skies over Iraq.
Controversial Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh and questions about Kavanaugh's drinking in the past.
Sean Hannity, come on up, Sean Hannity.
Today, Andrew Cuomo is having a moment.
Hello, I am Chris Direwolf.
And I'm Eliana Johnson.
And welcome to Inkstained Wretches, where we break down what's going wrong and what's going right with the American news media. Eliana Johnson. I am a woodland creature by heritage and by my raising. I prefer a cool glade, a tree-lined babbling brook in the mountains or the hills. So I greet the arrival of today with real anxiety because as the sun reaches its anger, you can feel the anger of the D.C. summer sun start to climb out and oppress me. I, like a raccoon or a bear, seek a cool spot to be. But then I realize there's nothing worse than a summer cold or a summer virus. And you have been afflicted, so I will complain no more.
Oh, I had no idea where that was going. But I was going to say we've had squirrels in our attic, so
okay.
You are very comfortable with woodland creatures.
It gets hot in an attic. It gets hot up in the attic.
Oh my gosh.
Basement.
I don't even want.
But are you feeling okay?
Definitely on the upswing.
All right, better is good.
Definitely on the upswing. All right. We have a packed front page. I will say, at the Free Beacon, we've been like the tip of the spear covering the lunacy on campus, and we're on the receiving end of a lot of snarky tweets and emails from folks in the mainstream media whose view was the stuff doesn't matter. Why are you obsessing about it? And now it's the biggest story in the country. And it is interesting to see its creep from sort of not a fringe story, but something that wasn't central to American politics to the major storyline, which brings us to our front page. The campus protests that are taking place from coast to coast. And what would they be without Washington Post coverage? The headline is, Trump GOP sees on-campus protests to depict chaos under Biden. And the Post writes, beyond the disruption to campus life, top Republicans have highlighted the anti-Semitic chants that have occurred at some of the protests. The issue is complicated by a debate over what constitutes anti-Semitism and when criticism of Israel crosses that line, while some student organizers have denounced the chants or said they're coming from outside activists. I don't think we really need to read this whole thing unless you want to, but it's true that Republicans are seizing on these protests because I think what the article doesn't get to is that it's a really good political issue for Republicans.
Yeah.
In general, the sense of chaos and disorder caused by the far left wing of the country is a really good issue for them.
It's a lot better than the coverage of Donald Trump's trial, for example.
It's a lot better. And it's an issue that splits the Democratic Party. So it's good. It's really good politics for Republicans. And the Beacon actually has an editorial out today on Biden's role in this, where he's like, when he's not trying to straddle both sides of this, and he's issued a couple statements through spokesmen, which are not really, that's when you want to talk about something as president, it's not really how you do it. But he said, look, I denounce anti-Semitism and I denounce people who don't care about the Palestinians. He's trying to straddle this issue. He's just trying to fade into the background. And that's tough to do while still looking presidential when on the major news story of the day.
as it relates to Biden, I think one of the things that we always have to remember, it doesn't matter what Biden should say, because Biden can't say. There's a trap that we hear left and right media about, well, Biden should be saying this, and I hear a lot of Democrats say, well, this is the message Biden should have, and on this and on a host of things. Here's the problem. He's a terrible messenger. He struggles to speak. I listened to the Smartless podcast, did an interview with Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and Bill Clinton. First of all, Bill Clinton is old. He is old. He now sounds like he is on the front porch of a general store in Arkadelphia talking about the good old days. So Bill Clinton is old. But Biden, this is the most friendly, favorable possible setting for an interview. And Obama had to bail him out again and again with these guys. So Biden just can't. People say, well, he needs to do an Oval Office address. Unless he screws it up. And then what do you got? So Biden, this is another example of where Biden's limitations as a communicator, because of his age and infirmity, and he was never that good to begin with, he is tightly circumscribed in his options. The Washington Post piece. Now, I cheated on this podcast by doing media criticism elsewhere. Normally, I try to keep all of my media criticism here with you. But that Washington Post story was such an effulgent dog leaving that the phrase is, the Republicans are seizing on the eruption of campus protests and using the, quote, they said it, mostly peaceful, student uprisings as a political cudgel. And everything that you say is true. And my point in this piece for the Dispatch was, who is harmed by that kind of tomfoolery? Who is harmed by that? Doesn't hurt Republicans, right? It doesn't hurt conservatives for the Washington Post to misascribe what's going on and to frame this as it's Republicans' fault. That's the same thing, and I point out here, it's the same thing right-wing media has done about January 6th and Trump's efforts to steal the election. But it's the same thing that the mainstream or left media did around the 2020 riots, right? It's the same thing. It's the same thing they did about defund the police. If you soothe and self-talk your own side, it makes your own side less willing to acknowledge political realities and life as it exists. And this is some real pap.
It also, it drives me crazy when, and I've heard, I was at a dinner recently, and my head almost exploded when members of the mainstream media say the right wing sows distrust in the media, and that's a real problem. And they take no responsibility for themselves sowing distrust in the media. When the Post writes something like this, that is not an accurate representation of what's going on, and people can see with their own eyes students breaking doors with hammers and entering the major hall at Columbia University, and it's major national news, and then read in the Washington Post that these things are mostly peaceful. And when students are fighting each other at UCLA, what they're reading in the paper is not consistent with what they're seeing on social media, on television, and elsewhere. And that sows distrust in the mainstream media.
In a television studio, in the television studio for News Nation, there's what we call the quad. And the quad is not where you put your pup tent for Hamas. The quad is MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, and News Nation on a four-way split screen so that we can see if news is breaking someplace else that we don't have the story yet, we can see what they're covering. And it's a useful tool. It's a particularly useful tool for media criticism because you get a snapshot at every moment about, okay, what are the stories that they think are important? Now, yesterday, we're recording this on Thursday, so on Wednesday, Fox, CNN, and News Nation were all covering this story because it's the biggest story. It's a cultural moment. It's a commentary on higher education. It deals with a contentious issue. There's related legislation on the Hill. What was MSNBC covering?
Tell me.
Trump trial. They were all the way shoved in on Trump trial. Why were they doing that? They have devoted a lot of resources to it, and they want to use those resources. So there's that. But there's the other thing. Their audience doesn't want to talk about the Trump trial. They don't want to talk about those things. They want to talk about things that make them feel good, which is the same reason, for example, Fox News was not going deep on the January 6th committee. So that's that part. But what occurs to me, and I think this goes to your point, the press on the issue of these protests does not take into account that the protests, and I'm not saying they're the fault of the press, but how much coverage was given to the initial protests and the initial upset within the Democratic Party about this issue? Lots, right? And to the credit or blame of the press, however you look at it, the media has mostly swung in against these protesters, right? We're now at a point of, whoa, this is out of hand. As James Carville said, if you see a turtle on a fence post, he didn't get there on his own. There's a lot of reasons that these students are goofballs. There's a lot of reasons for anti-Semitism. There's a lot of this stuff. But one contributing factor is the lionization in the press and the constant coverage in the press of the protests before they were violent and before they became so disruptive. And we can't then act surprised that they occurred.
Mostly peaceful, I guess, is true in the most narrow technical sense, that if you were to take the number of students who took a hammer and violently broke a window versus the number of students who did not engage in actual violence, it would be a small percentage. I guess that's what they're talking about, in the same sense that if you took the number of total people present at the January 6th rally versus the number that unlawfully entered the Capitol or broke windows or whatever, it was mostly peaceful.
It was mostly peaceful. The flight of the Enola Gay was mostly peaceful. There was that one thing they did where they dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, but really 99% of everything the Enola Gay did on that flight was peaceful.
But that, of course, is to miss like what is newsworthy and interesting about this, and also not to capture the atmosphere of that lawlessness. Like, these administrators have allowed and fostered this atmosphere of lawlessness, rule breaking, that has led to the escalation of a minority of these people to do this sort of thing. All of which is newsworthy, and to downplay it, I think, is missing what's important in all of this.
Preach.
Okay. Chris, this was so great. The AP had an article over last weekend. College protesters want amnesty. At stake, tuition, legal charges, grades, and graduation. And they write about how many of these student protesters are demanding that their records, who were arrested or suspended or expelled or whatever, demanding their records be wiped clean. And the AP writes, questions about their academic futures remain. Will they be allowed to take final exams? What about financial aid? Graduation? Columbia says outcomes will be decided at disciplinary hearings, but Alwan, that's one of these students, says she has not been given a date. This feels very dystopian, said Alwan, a comparative literature and society major. For international students facing suspension, there is the added fear of losing their visas, said Radhika Sainath, an attorney with Palestine Legal, which helped a group of Columbia students file a federal civil rights complaint against the school Thursday. It accuses Columbia of not doing enough to address discrimination against Palestinian students. The level of punishment is not even just draconian. It feels like over-the-top callousness, Sainath said. This is of a piece with the PhD student Johanna King-Slutsky at Columbia, who said she broke into...
I'm sorry, who?
Her name is Johanna King-Slutsky, PhD student in some fakakta discipline, who broke into the Hamilton Hall at Columbia and then said in a press conference
this is the DoorDash woman?
Yeah,
nice.
That said they need to bring them food because we're starving and we need humanitarian aid here in Hamilton Hall. isn't the whole idea of civil disobedience and protest is
Right.
that you are willing to suffer the consequences of doing it? I mean, it's so absurd.
Martin Luther King did not write a letter from outside the Birmingham
Yeah.
jail. He did not write a letter from a coffee shop near the Birmingham jail. He wrote a letter from the Birmingham jail. Yeah, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. I think, may I voice a profoundly unpopular opinion? Which is, so the students who, that young woman, and by the way, the guy behind her with his bare midriff T-shirt on, did you see the video? Did you watch the video or did you just read it?
I watched the video.
So
the bare midriff guy was amazing.
So she's there, and the bare midriff guy is behind her, and she's talking about how the meal plan has to serve their demands. You know, it just a preposterous degree of entitlement and all of that stuff. So then heroes in the media arose. And who were the heroes? The bros, right? So the
Oh my gosh.
So
And do you know that our good friend, well, I'll get to it, the guys at UNC.
yeah, guys at UNC, and I think there were some elsewhere, but the bro community has come to fight back against they're the resistance against the resistance. And at one school, they were part of tearing down a tent city. And the most notable one is at the University of North Carolina. They came out and held Old Glory from being besmirched, and I am for them. This is a very good thing.
Well, this was amazing because our dear friend John Noonan, former staffer to Senator Tom Cotton, he will be embarrassed that I outed him on this podcast.
Snitch it.
Started a GoFundMe for these kids, and by the end of the day, it had raised $300,000 to throw them a party to thank them for their work. And a friend of mine calls me at 8:00 last night and says, "Did you know that was our John Noonan who did that?" I said, "Yeah, of course I knew that." He's like, "I just assumed it was somebody else." So he's now hired like a professional party planner to throw these kids a party.
So then my opinion will be especially unpopular, because the idea that that there are two modes of entitlement on display. One is the mode of entitlement that says, bring us our meal plan even as we smash in the windows and occupy the building. There's another form of entitlement around college, that the point of college is to get hammered and party down. And I don't think John Noonan's intention was to contribute to this. Probably an innocent idea that these young men deserve a reward. But the idea of college as, let me put it this way, in defense of hypocrisy, college has always been a place where people have dumb ideas. College has always been a place where people drink too much and party too hard. And the point of a movie like Animal House, or whatever its imitators subsequently were, was that you want to be one of the cool guys. You want to be one of these other people. But the reinforcement of college as either a gender studies major with a belly button ring on an exposed midriff talking about the inhumanity of not letting DoorDash come through when you've done the building, or that
AKA humanitarian aid,
or that the proper reward for young men, some of whom I assume are underage, is to get trashed. Like, don't say it out loud. Don't do that. That would have been better if that was money being raised for a scholarship or something else. So there's I knew it would be unpopular, but now an even more profoundly unpopular opinion.
I really think the point is, to having been in touch directly with a lot of these kids, the protests are intended to exert power and control over the schools. And it is, I think, important for the kids who oppose them or feel threatened by them to understand that there are people outside who, A, care about what's going on, are watching what's going on, but who aren't on campus, where they may be actually the minority, who who are willing to come in and offer support. Now, this is a lighthearted form of support, but it is important, I think, for them to know that the university campus and the forces at play there are not representative of the larger world, and that when you step foot off this campus, the forces at play are completely different, and people are watching, and there is a reward for standing up, doing the right thing, showing some spine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I agree 100%. And by the way, we've seen real courage from some administrators. We saw Ben Sass down at the University of Florida. I thought that the president at the University of Chicago had a very good stance on this. But I love the guy from the University of North Carolina. I think he's the interim, who gave his remarks while they're screaming at him, gave his remarks at Chapel Hill and said, that flag stands for all of us. That flag stands for every American, whether you agree with the support for Israel or don't. That when you attack that flag, you're attacking a symbol that is supposed to unite us. But here's my word to the wise for the bros at the University of North Carolina. If you want, and one thing they should know is some of them are going to get awesome jobs as a result of that, right? There is a wider world out there of people who want to show support for people who support the American flag. But here would be the pro move to say, we would love to have we'd love to have a $200,000 rager, but we'd like to take that money and do blank with it. We'd like to do something. We'd like to pay for school, or we'd like to do whatever else, and not live down to the brotastical stereotype.
Speaking of the statements put out, there were so many of them, and they varied in quality so much. We should direct people. The Free Beacon has a piece up this morning that collected all of the statements so people can find them in one place. Because I think it's useful for folks to see. We categorize them, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So you can see what all the different schools said, their different approaches to handling this, and make up your mind for yourself.
You mean like giving in to the demands of the protests for appeasement?
I would say Northwestern and Brown were at the bottom of the barrel.
Peace at any price.
MIT.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Peace at any price.
Were the Munich agreements of 2024.
And I only do want to point to a great piece that Jonah Goldberg wrote, a headline, "These are the kids they wanted." And the idea that the way that we will deal with these protests is by hiring more people to teach these kids to protest is a particularly circular kind of logic.
Well, of a piece with that is the New York Times profile of the student who was supposedly barred from Columbia campus, who's a leader of this protest. The New York Times headline is "Columbia bars student protester who said Zionists don't deserve to live." After video surfaced on social media, the student, Kaimani James, said on Friday that his comments were wrong. What was so amazing about this was that he said this to Columbia administrators in a disciplinary hearing in January. And then only when he was shamed 6 months later, when the Daily Wire reported it, did they actually do anything about it. They sat on their hands in January when he said this to them. But when Jonah says these are the kids they wanted, the kicker to this piece, the final two paragraphs say, Mr. James was raised in Boston and graduated from Boston Latin Academy, according to a 2021 interview with the Bay State Banner. That's, one of the most prestigious schools in Boston. He told the Banner that at Columbia, he planned to study economics and political science. The ultimate destination is Congress, he said. But
sadly, this checks out.
One of the things that I've been thinking about through all of this is that these kids think they're rebelling against something.
Right.
They're actually totally conformist.
Right.
This is what this kid was taught at Boston Latin School. This is what all the professors teach them at Columbia. They are 100% conformist and doing what they have been taught.
And we should mention the George Packer piece in the Atlantic that traces some of the roots of this, and something I talked about last week about the lionization of protest and the baby boomer nostalgia for the anti-Vietnam protests that weren't, right? The false construction of these effective and important and worthwhile Vietnam protests that achieved nothing, right? They did not achieve anything. And in fact, got Richard Nixon elected twice, helped get Richard Nixon elected twice.
All right. On to 2024.
Do it.
NBC News has poll. Biden and Trump supporters sharply divided by the media they consume. Do you want to read it? Because my voice is not great.
This is a good, so the NBC News poll is a good poll. We like people. Some people say it's the best, but NBC News has a Democrat and a Republican pollster. They work together, come up with a good poll. We like it, and I'm flagging this because it's kind of a follow-on to what we talked about with the Trump jury and what they consume and how tight the media bubble is for people. So presidential preference varies widely by news consumption. Among those people who don't follow political news at all, Trump wins 53%. People who get their news from YouTube or Google, Trump wins 55%. Trump wins 53% of the cable news audience. He wins 46 to 42 on people who primarily get their news from social media. Digital websites, Biden wins 49-39. National network news, Biden 55 to Trump 35. And newspapers, Biden leads 70 to 21. So you see here this very stark depiction of where the right gets its news or doesn't get its news and where the left gets its news and doesn't get its news. This doesn't tell us much about how the election's going to go, but it definitely, we talk about siloed media. Well, you've got some these look like actual silos, right? They're tall and skinny with voters packed into them and goes to the point. And I will say, social media and cable news do the best at having a mixed audience. Those platforms have the most mixed audience.
Up next, we got to play this clip. We have Nancy Pelosi on MSNBC.
It's a beauty.
Unhappy with a question that she was asked. Let's play the clip.
And Joe Biden is doing that, created 9 million jobs in his term in office. Donald Trump has the worst record of job loss of any president. So we just have to make sure people know.
That was a global pandemic.
He had the worst record of any president. We've had other concerns in our country. If you want to be an apologist for Donald Trump, that may be your role, but it ain't mine. And he has the worst. I don't think that anybody can accuse me of that.
Imagine, I mean, I'm sure Donald Trump has done that to plenty of right of center people or has in certain circumstances. But imagine feeling so offended that a journalist would make a passing point. Katie Tur did not say Donald Trump is great. She said, to point out, Joe Biden's record for job creation is predicated on lighting the economy on fire and throwing it down the bottom of a mine shaft with the pandemic. So just for context, and the way that she scolded her was really wow. That was a wow for me.
Up next, we have the New York Times piece. Donald Trump has never sounded like this. No major American presidential candidate has talked like he does at his rallies. Not Richard Nixon, not George Wallace, not even Donald Trump himself.
I was prepared to dislike this story. Charles Homans wrote this piece, and I was prepared for a lot of trope trafficking and all that stuff. I don't 100% agree with his conclusions, but it is well-researched, it is well put together, and it does effectively track the change in Donald Trump's rhetoric over time from somebody who has gone to all of these rallies. And I thought it was good, and they did it in a way they embed audio into the piece, and I think just as a way to present the news, this is a good idea that the Times has, so that as you're reading through, you can just click on the quote, and it plays the audio as you go through. And I think just as a technique, that's very good.
It's cool.
But I think the piece generally is useful, and I would encourage Trump supporters particularly to read it because there has been a change. Things are different now than they were in 2020.
All right, up next. This might have been last week, but this piece really amused me from our friends at Axios. Biden changes walking routine to Marine One.
Zoom in.
And there are two pictures side by side, one of Biden walking alone and one of Biden walking and surrounded by 4 aides. And the piece is about how Biden doesn't want the cameras to capture his stiff and halting gait. So he has aides walk around him in a circle so the cameras can't pick this up. President Biden has introduced a change to his White House departure and return routine. Instead of walking across the South Lawn to and from Marine One by himself, he's now often surrounded by aides. Why it matters. With aides walking between Biden and journalists' camera position outside the White House, the visual effect is to draw less attention to the 81-year-old's halting and stiff gait. Amazing.
And good for Axios for pointing it out. And the theater of the presidency continues unabated, and probably a good idea because it is excruciating to watch Biden walk places.
And it also notes that this idea came from Biden. So, you think? Genius.
Do we think Biden? Do we really think?
It says, weeks ago, the president told aides that he'd prefer a less formal approach. A White House official told Axios he suggested that they walk with him.
Oh, well.
Okay.
All right.
He must know he looks like a old sack of bones.
He does indeed. He does indeed. Now, everybody else has talked about this, and I hate to even include it. And Drew Barrymore is not a journalist. But Kamala Harris was treating her like one by going on her chat show to talk about, in between recipes and celebrity news, to talk to Drew Barrymore about the race. And it's a great example of how an easy interview can backfire on you. So here is what Drew Barrymore said to Kamala Harris.
I've been thinking that we really all need a tremendous hug in the world right now. Yeah. But in our country, we need you to be Mamala of the country.
Drew Barrymore asking her to be the Mamala of the country, and you can't see it if you're listening to this but it's a cringy, desperate thing. And the look on the Curb Your Enthusiasm look on Kamala Harris's face. And Drew Barrymore here is the embodiment of what you talked about last week, which is she's found her stride. She's found her voice. Here she is. She's the strange new love for Kamala Harris. And was this good for Kamala Harris or bad for Kamala Harris? Did Drew Barrymore help her? No, she hurt her. This was not, it was a friendly interview that was non-helpful.
I think that's what I did when I met Bill Barr for the first time.
You need him to be...
Everyone around probably cringed.
That you told him he should be the mama...
The Popala of the country.
The Popala of the country. There you go.
All right. On to our inside the media news.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know what to call it.
The biz. In the biz.
In the biz. All right. So first we have Puck on Elon Musk's dinner parties. Guess who's coming to Elon's dinner? On a brisk Friday evening earlier this month, David Sachs and Elon Musk convened a dozen or so of America's most powerful business leaders for dinner at Sachs's $23 million, 11,000 square foot home in the Hollywood Hills. The dinner party, according to people familiar with the intimate gathering, comprised a veritable living room Milken conference. Michael Milken himself was there, in fact, as were billionaires Rupert Murdoch and Peter Thiel. A few government types, including Steven Mnuchin, scored invites. There were also some less politically active titans of industry, such as Uber co-founder and former CEO Travis Kalanick, but all were there as members of a burgeoning anti-Biden brain trust united by a shared sense of grievance.
Murdoch and Elon have a close relationship, and James Murdoch sits on the Tesla board. One of the things that has bedeviled Fox, right-wing media generally, is they're fighting over their chunk of the marketplace. If Fox and Twitter or X are complementary to each other. Now, we saw what happened with Tucker Carlson leaves Fox, gets booted at Fox, and then goes over to Elon Musk. But if Fox and X, which have 90% of 80% of the right-wing audience, it's in some way or another, if they really could collaborate and really could cooperate, it would be much more effective. I am just doubtful. The inclusion here that James Murdoch sits on the Tesla board, I bet James Murdoch does not like Elon Musk. I think that's probably a safe bet that he does not like Elon Musk and is part of the hostile presence on the board. So I'm skeptical of the ability of this collection of billionaires to actually cooperate against Biden.
Up next, I would say this is pretty marginal media news.
This guy.
There was an amusing, I don't even know what you call it, public resignation. This guy, Ken Klippenstein, posted a note on why he's resigning from The Intercept.
And this was Glenn Greenwald was there, and then he left.
Glenn was there.
Yeah.
He says, "In my time at The Intercept, I watched the newsroom increasingly become dominated by management and bureaucrats whose numbers continue to swell as the number of people who actually produce news dwindles. While The Intercept now has one poor copy editor for the entire website, it employs 2 staff attorneys as well as a legal fellow, a chief strategy officer, a chief digital officer, blah, blah, blah. He complains an editor-in-chief now answers to the CEO, and complains that they're very good at one thing, structuring hush money payments, meaning that when people leave,
they sign non-disclosure.
Multiple outgoing Intercept staffers have been offered severance packages in exchange for signing non-disclosure agreements. I'm just going to say, that is how it normally works. Severance in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement.
I flag this not because of how The Intercept works or does not work, and I'm not familiar with Ken Klippenstein. But this paragraph caught my attention. He said in his goal of going and starting a Substack, he said, "I want to be an unabashed partisan for the vast majority of Americans who despise the people who run the country, putting my finger in the eye of the elites, frog marching us through their managed decline of the American standard of living." Who are you talking about? Who is this guy actually talking about? You think the vast majority of Americans despise the people who run the country? No, they don't. They may not care. Some of them despise them, but the vast majority of Americans do not despise the people who run the country. And the idea that your blog is going to put your finger in the eye of the elites, frog marching us through their managed decline of the American standard of living. I mean, I talk about it all the time, and I'm sorry to repeat myself. Getting into journalism as a way to be an advocate for something is the wrong idea. And if you get so high on your own supply that you convince yourself that a vast majority of Americans join you in despising the people who run this country, you will drift off into the ether like this cat.
Touche. All right. Should we do this next item? Ben Collins on Twitter.
The Onion.
News. My friends and I now own and run The Onion. I'll be the CEO. We're keeping the entire... Is this real?
Yeah.
We're keeping the entire staff, bringing back the Onion News Network, and share the wealth with staff. Not some kind of typo there. We're going to let them do whatever they want. Get excited. I don't know. I'm not excited.
You're not? I'm excited. I love The Onion.
Well, I'm not a fan of this. Is this a different Ben Collins than the one?
Same Ben
yeah,
Collins.
no, I'm not a fan. I don't think he's going to be funny.
I'm a fan of The Onion, and I hope that it is funny. And I'm not familiar with his work, but I'm excited.
Big on the disinformation beat. I don't know where you've been, Chris.
Oh, I don't stay up much on the disinformation beat, but I hope the Onion is successful. I'm pro Onion.
My hopes are not high.
We'll check back
okay,
and
we'll
see
check
how they
back.
do.
We'll check back. And then we close out with a piece from the Dispatch on the Cass review.
Yeah, this was great.
This was a great piece, but enlighten us. What is the Cass review, and why will it not fade away?
So this is a piece by Jesse Singal, who has a popular podcast and I thought of him as a man of the left pretty substantially. So talking about the politics of transgenderism is hard and complicated because you've got science and you've got all kinds of stuff. But the Cass review, basically it goes like this. The Netherlands was the front runner in gender reassignment surgery and medical interventions on gender reassignment, going back to adults, and then when it came to kids. And Britain's National Institutes of Health wanted to replicate basically what they were doing for young people with gender dysmorphia to create a way for them to obtain treatment. And after lawsuits started landing from people who had detransitioned, and it became such an evolving scandal and point of anxiety, they got Hilary Cass, who was a very well-regarded pediatrician and an expert, to do a comprehensive study, and she did. And what she came back with was very tough, and it was made more tough by the fact that she did it in a very even-handed and compassionate way about the scientism or pseudoscience around, and this is not Andrew Sullivan's dishcast, so I will not belabor the issue, but the treating of the issue of trans as a medical issue that should be addressed like polio or something never was going to feed the bulldog. And when you're talking about radical interventions that could render young people sterile or lead to inalterable changes, real dubious, right? Real dubious stuff. And if you want to know more, I recommend the Jesse Singal piece very much. And this is just a marker that I'm laying down that this is coming to the United States. This controversy, and 60 Minutes has done it, and the New York Times has done it. So there has been
totally
coverage.
Agree. And the Beacon actually did a long piece on the American Academy of Pediatrics standards for treatment of pediatric transgender care. They have radical guidelines that suggest the extreme interventions, hormones for kids that are out of step with those of the rest of the world, and which is why I think this is coming to the United States. But the way those guidelines were made, which is what the Beacon's piece is about, is disturbing, and the whole issue is you see like the unscientific approach and the intervention of activists in this.
The trans movement, especially as it relates to young people, in many ways functioned as an extension of the battle for gay rights, gay marriage, and other recognitions that people of same-sex attraction sought in the United States. But it's not a continuation. It is there are qualitative and quantitative differences. How many people with gender dysmorphia are there? And medical interventions for young people is totally different than saying that gay or lesbian adults should be allowed to marry somebody or shouldn't face discrimination. It's just a very different kind of thing. And I think a lot of folks jumped into that debate thinking that it was a continuation when it is, in fact, something different.
All right. Chris, that brings us to our Facile File. And we have...
It's one item, but it's primo.
Okay, I think all of the... All right, we have a few items that could go in here. Only 32
failed.
of the top movies in the last decade say climate change exists.
This is from IndieWire.
I mean,
They write, even a passing mention of terms like climate change, global warming, the climate crisis, or other environmental phrases were enough to qualify for inclusion, and not many cleared even that bar. The report mentions a conversation between Batman and Aquaman in Justice League, in which Batman mentions melting the polar ice caps and destroying the ecosystem. In Triangle of Sadness, which is, by the way, what I'm going to call IndieWire from now on, is a triangle of sadness. A climate mention isn't even spoken, but it's mentioned on an LED billboard when it reads, "There is a new climate entering the world of fashion." So they're saying very generous. It was very easy to not be on the naughty list. And yet only 32 of the million most popular movies in the past decade. And I like the idea that somehow that because Bad Boys for Life or American Sniper or Top Gun Maverick did not make an adequate mention of climate change, that they were failing.
In sea change levels.
Yeah. That in Bad Boys for Life, they should have had a whole run of plot about how the real villains were polluters. And this is the kind of let art be art, dummies. Just let it be art. Let people make what they want to make, consume what they want to consume. You do not have, if I may, Ernest Hemingway, love him or hate him, whatever you want, basically dodged politics in the 1930s. When he was writing, he basically was trying to duck politics. And then under pressure from the much more political writers around him, he wrote a piece, his book, To Have and Have Not, which, by the way, it was made into a great movie. Humphrey Bogart, speaking of bad things in Hollywood, that's where a married 38 or 40-year-old Humphrey Bogart met a 17-year-old Lauren Bacall, and they started their romance. So stipulate that. But Hemingway ground out this, his worst book. He had a first book that was worse, but his worst book because he was trying to match the political pieties and answer the pressure of the people around him. Don't pressure people to make political art. Stop doing that.
I mean, it's the same as, could we do a list of the movies that didn't mention the Uyghur genocide in the past?
Very few. Few Uyghur genocide mentions. Though maybe Bad Boys for Life did it. I don't know. I haven't seen Bad Boys for Life.
This, I think, should also be in Facile File. CNBC reports Dave & Buster's to allow customers to bet on arcade games.
Oh, man.
And I think we were sitting here last week because I was going on CNN, and one of the topics was sports gambling.
Oh, yeah, we talked about that.
And the partnership between the major sports leagues and, whatever, DraftKings and stuff.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't really know. Like, what do you think? But this I have an opinion on.
What's your opinion?
Dave & Buster's, I mean, this is like 4 children. 4 children.
Yep.
Come on. This is bad.
I don't want gambling to be made illegal. I think if people want to gamble, I gamble. I think if people want to gamble, they should gamble. What is the stock market except for gambling, right? So I'm not here saying that the state should crack down on gambling and that we need to have more restrictions. What I am saying is these companies should think about what they're endorsing, right? They should think about what they want to associate themselves with, and bringing gambling to, as you say, a place for children to have birthday parties is that is not cool. It is uncool.
And finally, at Die Workwear on Twitter.
At DIE Workwear.
Die, right?
He goes by Die. Yeah, it's Derek.
Okay.
So it's Derek Guy, menswear writer, editor at Put This On, creator of Ralph Lauren Goes Hard, bylines at the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, Esquire, and Mr. Porter. Look, I love this guy. His sense of style.
Right, I need to follow him.
His sense of style, his impeccable, right?
I just followed him.
He's got great taste, and he gives good. And one of the things that I like about him is I don't agree with the choices that he honors in all cases, because I'm a real tight you-know-what when it comes to how I like to dress and what I like to do. But it's a big tent in terms of things that he thinks can be okay, but basically focuses on precepts. And I recommend everyone to follow him at DIE Workwear. But I'll just read it. Someone from Piers Morgan's staff asked if I would like to come on to Piers' show, Piers Morgan Uncensored, to talk about the state of his attire. Since he invited feedback, I thought I'd do a thread comparing his style to menswear icon Kermit the Frog. And what follows is and I'm against cruelty, but is the best takedown of how Piers Morgan dresses. And by the way, points out that Kermit the Frog is a baller. And Kermit the Frog does dress really well. And I'm pro Frog. I'm 100% pro Frog. I'm a Muppet enthusiast. But he goes through and points out all of the ways. So here, for a more casual look, Piers often wears these plain, smooth merino sweaters in solid colors. These sweaters can sometimes be fine under a tailored jacket, but on their own, they lack something. No such issue for Kermit the Frog. He knows that if you're going to wear a sweater on its own, the knit needs to be something like a pattern or texture to make it interesting. Good options include spongy Shetlands, chunky Arons, Fair Isles, and ribbed shaker knits. This cat went through and he found all of 50 pictures of Kermit the Frog and of Piers Morgan, how they're dressed. It's just, mwah.
Chris, that brings us to our obsessions of the week, where we break down the stories we can't get out of our heads.
You got some primo stuff.
I spent last night watching the Netflix, a documentary on Netflix about Dan Rather. I think it's just called Rather. That is basically a hagiography. It's about his career, his daughter's in it, his grandson's in it. All of his producers at CBS News from over the years are in it. Who is not in it is anybody who is critical of Dan Rather. So at the very end, they get to Rathergate, when in 2004, Dan Rather on 60 Minutes 2 aired a story about how George W. Bush had absconded from his duty in the Texas Air National Guard and showed documents from, whoever his commanding officer, superior.
Internal memoranda from the Texas Air National Guard.
But they were shown to be forgeries. And it gets to this, and the lead up to it is, they say the right really hated Dan Rather, and they were out to get Dan Rather. They had made him a villain. And the Bush family, he had done an interview with George H.W. Bush, and they just really hated him. And they essentially say that he was set up by the Bush family to fall into this trap.
Oh, he was entrapped into reporting false information.
And Rather himself says, the terrible thing is that the story was true. The story was true. And there's one CBS News producer, Susan Zirinsky. She went on to be the president of CBS for a short time, who says, look, if you're going to take a swing at someone, you have to have the goods. Dan's mistake was being too trusting in his producers. But again, that was his mistake. It was his job, not, to check things out. But every other producer interviewed says he was a martyr. This story was true. Nobody faults him. But gently, Susan Zirinsky, certainly not Dan Rather. Doesn't say sorry. And actually, they say he was a victim of this scheme. And if you want to watch something that shows the in-crowd thinking of the mainstream media and why it has become what it is, and their view that they are under assault from outside forces who are attacking truth, when they were wrong. They aired
Fake but accurate.
documents.
Fake but accurate, said the New York Times.
This is the thing for you.
And I think it caught lots of, I think even the...
Oh, and the other amazing thing about this is the whole documentary up until the Rathergate part, they say, he's such an intrepid reporter. He's just an incredible newsman. Well, and then it gets to this, and there's like no explanation for how the intrepid reporter let these fake documents get by him. It's incredible.
Dan Rather, do you remember what Dan Rather's sign off on the CBS Evening News was?
Well, they go into how he wanted to say courage.
Courage.
But then the executives came in and told him.
And for a period of time, for at least once, he I think I may be misremembering this, but in the context of the Sandinistas, but something about Latin America, said coraje.
Oh my God.
He said coraje. Don't make Dan Rather is the next Bill Moyers. He's already the next Bill Moyers, and it's quite a lot. It's quite a lot.
It's worth watching for a window into how the mainstream media perceives this incident itself and so on.
I'll be watching Magnum PI, but yes, I already know. Were you familiar with Asterisk magazine? Asterisk magazine is a tech magazine, and I think it must be fairly new. And I don't know enough about it to be supportive or enthusiastic, but I'm definitely intrigued. And my gateway was a piece by Timothy B. Lee, a tech journalist who's worked a bunch of other places, and I guess has his own Substack. I assume he has his own Substack. But he wrote a piece for Asterisk called Debugging Tech Journalism. And I'm here to tell you, it's sound as the pound. And he lays out how tech journalism got broken, how it got captured, how the normal rules of journalism got lost along the way, about how coverage is distorted, and roots it all in very pragmatic approaches to how you're supposed to cover anything, whether it's tech or not, and does it in a very helpful way, because I think a lot of people who did get into tech journalism did not come through the normal pathway of journalism, but wanted to be in and around tech. There's like entertainment reporters, right? They wanted to be in and around entertainment, and then journalism was a way to do that. And so it's a very good piece, but he makes a point and that I am obsessed with. He writes this: the irony of the growing antagonism between Silicon Valley and the media is that Silicon Valley created the economic environment that has driven the transformation of media over the past 20 years. No one specific person or company is to blame for this. The invention of the internet probably made it inevitable that the media industry would become more competitive and therefore less profitable. But design decisions by tech giants have certainly made the problem worse over the past decade. And people in Silicon Valley could be doing more to help if they wanted to. But the people in Silicon Valley who could do the most good are those at Google, especially the ones who run Google News. Google is one of the largest sources of traffic for news sites. The Google News algorithm doesn't encourage clickbait the way Facebook's newsfeed did during the mid-2010s. But Google also doesn't seem to work very hard to identify and promote exceptional journalism in search results. If Google started doing this and being transparent about how they are doing it, it might create a financial incentive for news organizations to invest in more quality. In part, this happens because a big company doing something wrong is more colorful story. Well, this is conclusion. But that part about just that change, we have a lot of lawsuits. We have a lot of stuff. There's antitrust measures. There's all of those things. But if Google were to reward better journalism, it would be a really good thing. And I know from dealing with people at Google, they do want to do better, right? They want it to do better. They want to not have clickbait dominate. They want to do those things. And I'm sure it's harder than I understand to reward because you get into subjective standards. But I think there are ways to incentivize better journalism and reward people for it. And I'm here with you, Timothy B. Lee.
Chris, that brings us to my favorite time of the week, which
Heck
is
yeah.
reader mail. And we have a great note and a correction from Don Weingarten in New
Okay.
York. Don't worry, it's a correction of me.
Oh, okay. Then I'm
writes,
cool.
Eliana,
Then we're cool,
you
Don.
guys do a great job. I'm a fan. However, I was there for the full 1968 Columbia student seizure of buildings and police bus. The often repeated claim, which I just heard from you, that hundreds of students were injured in the bust is absolute, complete nonsense. Of the 700 some odd arrested, I know of only 2 people who were injured. Michael Steinloff, who hid in a kitchen cabinet in the math building and had to be dragged out, and John Giorno, Lower East Side poet and not a student, with whom I and others ran across campus knocking over garbage cans as the police were clearing the buildings and chasing off campus the small number of us still there, but not in buildings. Overall, the police reaction was remarkably restrained. It did, however, result in a relatively brief counter-reaction by the remainder of students not involved in the seizure. I will spare you my long story on the subject, but close with this. The student strike was a bad thing. We were wrong. Seen from now, 56 years later, I think we helped by some marginal amount impose a communist dictatorship on the people of on the people of Vietnam. I'm not at all proud to have been involved.
Wow. Cool.
Wonderful
Mr.
note.
Weingarten.
Thank you for the note.
Cool. That's really cool. Thank you.
Chris, that brings us now to your favorite time of the week, when I am forced to say something nice. But you first.
What a great piece in the Wall Street Journal by Margot Patrick. Headline: Billions in dirty money flies under the radar at world's busiest airports. The Heathrow to Dubai flights have 2 big money laundering features. One airport doesn't scan outbound luggage for cash, and the other welcomes sacks of it. And taken one way, this is a piece that is talking about a flaw in the system at Heathrow, and it does focus on that. But what I love it for and what's good about it is the depth of reporting, the detail, packed with detail, the visuals, they captured the social media, they went into the evidence files. This reporter, Margot Patrick, put in an extraordinary amount of work for this, and her editors at the Journal obviously gave her a lot of time and many resources to do this story, and it's just fascinating. It's just if you like true crime, if you like that stuff, this is a spectacularly interesting piece.
All right, well, mine is a far cry from that.
Okay.
Outside the Columbia encampment, RIP, there was a sign, a QR code that said "Lost and Found." Go here. And so, of course, there were photographs of this, and you could just jump in the chat and see what was there, and folks did. So one of the postings in this Lost and Found chat was, I lost my Adderall. I know people will be tempted to keep it, but please, I have really bad ADHD. I need it back. And our satirist, the amazing Andrew Stiles, took that. The exact posting was, "Okay, exclamation point. I lost an orange plastic bottle of 10 milligrams extended release Adderall, probably about 15 blue capsules. I can share name on prescription in DM. I understand many might want to keep, but I have extreme ADHD and really need it. Please message me ASAP if found." So Stiles did a satirical take on the rest of the entries in this, including missing. Someone stole the for the death of Empire sign hanging outside our tent. Please return ASAP. Found. One prosthetic foot with roller skate attached. And one moleskin notebook labeled personal diary. DM for more info. There's a missed connection in there. And it's hilarious.
Excellent.
I highly recommend it.
Excellent.
Well, that is all the time we have for the news about the news. If you have a story you want us to talk about, email us at wretches@nebulouspodcast.com and sign up for our newsletter at nebulouspodcast.com. This has been Ink-Stained Wretches from Nebulous Media, produced by Colin Chicola. Find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Wretches.